the acceptable range so that things don't get too hot, too low. Hey guys, just wanted to do a quick video about what all the levels should be on each of your gauges. What's the acceptable range so that things don't get too hot, too low, too cold, whatever. What's the acceptable range on all these gauges? Sure are a lot of them in my truck, so I got the perfect candidate to show you guys. But I'm going to show you the acceptable ranges in all the truck, all the gauges and everything. When you got a good outside, so a lot of these might be a little bit low. Obviously, engine's not running. Let's start with oil pressure. Now, on a pack car, and Cummins, it's at least 35, and it could be a little bit higher. That's after it's warmed up. Now, watch my other video about low oil or high oil pressure, because when it's too high, it could just be because your water temperature and oil temperature subsequently are not high enough. So anywhere between 35, just look at the normal range when you're normally driving, but at least 35. And generally, you know, if you have a cat, it'll run a lot higher, but never above 60 usually when you're going down the road in most trucks. Now, the next thing is probably one of the most important is the water temperature. Now, the thing about water temperature is water boils at 212 degrees. So you notice this, it'll go up to 220 sometimes, and then the fan will kick on, bring it back down to 180. But make sure it doesn't go over 220. But if it's running anywhere close to there regularly, that's bad. But if the fan kicks on at 220, because the way the cooling system works, it adds pressure. It holds 16 pounds of pressure, which increases the boiling point to around 240. So you still have cooling capacity when it gets up to 220. Make sure your fan kicks on, brings it back down. If fan's not kicking on at that point, you probably have a fan clutch bad or something. But it should run between 180 and 200 on a normal day. Next most important thing is your voltage. Now that's going to tell you if your alternator's bad or if you need new batteries. Mostly your alternator when the truck's running. Now, as you can see, I have the key on where it's just above 12 volts. Sometimes it'll be, you know, close to 13 if your batteries are just, you know, higher than normal. But when it's running, you always want it between 13.7 and 14 volts. Any more than that and you're overcharging it, any less than that and it's undercharging, check out the alternator. Fuel gauge, well, just make sure that doesn't get too low. Next is your primary and secondary air pressure gauges. Now, you actually have a valve in your compressor, and it'll keep building pressure until it gets up to around 120, and then it'll close that valve or open that valve, pressure release valve, and then gently, you know, it'll just regulate it. And if you use more pressure, it will go down. So that's basically how the compressor works. So make sure it's not below like 110 and doesn't go above like around 130. That's basically the acceptable range, primary and secondary. You got two tanks here. Next, we got basically all the extra gauges. Those are the primary gauges. Now here we have the amp meter. That basically tells you you're going to stay at around 14 volts, but this is going to tell you how much amps are in each of those volts, basically. And so you want your batteries to charge at a certain voltage the whole time. But it'll adjust the amperage. It's just better for the batteries that way than to keep adjusting the voltage and just giving out maximum amperage. Better for your batteries, better for your fuel mileage because your alternator's not doing as much work. Your oil temperature. Now this should be about 10 to 20 degrees higher than your water temperature. Generally, trucks will have a heat exchanger, so the oil and the water will run together at some point. And so the water absorbs heat from the oil. So oil is going to be a little bit higher than the water temperature, but make sure it's not any more than 10 to 20 degrees hotter. Make sure it doesn't go above 250. But generally it'll run around 190. This is your turbo gauge. Most trucks are set at 40 psi on the wastegate. So if it's giving you less than that, or less than it usually does, you probably have a problem with your ECM, your turbo, or a boost leak or something along those lines, or a DPF. But generally, when you're flooring it and high RPM, 40 is the highest you'll go. What we got here is the trailer air supply. Well, that's just whatever your regular air tanks are. That's basically how much is in your air tanks. Not a lot of trucks have that. It's superfluous. Next is your fuel filter gauge. Very important. This is in inches of mercury. Odd measurement, but it is a measurement of pressure. In between 5 and 10. If it gets above 10, think about changing that fuel filter. Def level, just keep it topped off. Suspension load, that just depends on how much weight is on your axles. So we'll just bust through that. Generally most trucks, when you get to 60, you're at 34,000 on your axles, but it's a good way to tell your weight. Trans temperature, just make sure it doesn't get above 220, 230 or so. Generally that one stays around between 150 and 180. It fluctuates a lot. There's a trans cooler on most trucks, so if not all, don't correct me. I'm not 100% sure, but yeah, between 150 and 180 up to 220 or so. Now these are your front axle and rear axle. These are your differential temperatures. It depends on what kind of oil you use. You got 75W90 in there. I wouldn't go let it get above 200 before you park it and let it rust, cool down if you're pulling hills, or even when you're going downhill too, or going around through a city. Sometimes these will heat up, but generally it's when you're going up a hill, you got a lot of stress on your drive line. But don't let it get above 200 if you have 75W90 in there. If you have 75W140, a little bit thicker fluid, it has a higher heat capacity. That could probably get up to 230 before it gets too bad. And that's generally this will run around 150 or so in the summertime. Maybe a little bit cooler in the winter. And brake applied pressure, all that means is just how much pressure when you're hitting the brakes. When you're at 25, you're hitting them pretty hard. I mean, if you're at 50, that's like an emergency stop. So this could kind of help guide you when you're going downhill or something. You don't want to have more than like 20 pounds or so. You start cooking your brakes. And that's basically it. Those are what the acceptable ranges of all these gauges in most trucks. And you got a little bonus because I got all these extras. But yeah, that's what it is.